The red and blue lights cut through the late afternoon haze, their reflection flashing against the dusty windows of a battered Ford pickup. The truck sputtered as it rolled to the shoulder, coughing like an old man out of breath, before finally stilling. Its driver, Samuel Drake, 83 years old, kept both hands steady on the wheel. His knuckles, scarred and veined, rested with the patience of a man who'd been stopped before, not by traffic police, but by insurgents, rebels, and death itself. The first officer stepped out of the cruiser, young and full of swagger. His sunglasses mirrored the truck's rusted hood. He smirked, tapping the fender with the tip of his flashlight. "What do we have here? No plates, no tags. You driving this heap straight out of a junkyard, old man?" The second officer joined in, circling like a vulture. "Maybe stolen. Or maybe Grandpa here thinks the law doesn't apply to him. Got your license, registration, or just good excuses?" Laughter followed their words, not from the crowd because at first, there was no crowd but from themselves. Their voices rang sharp in the dry New Mexico air, mocking and cruel. Samuel didn't look up. He kept his eyes forward, both hands still on the wheel, his jaw tight but calm. He said nothing. Silence was safer. He had learned long ago that the loudest man in the room usually had the least power, and that patience could be sharper than any blade. The officers exchanged a glance, mistaking his quiet for confusion. One yanked the door open and pulled him out, setting him on the curb like a scolded child. Gravel bit into his palms as he lowered himself, but he didn't flinch. Phones came out. A teenager across the street lifted his camera, already whispering commentary for a video he would upload to TikTok within minutes. "Check this out. Cops got some old guy, probably drunk. Grandpa's in trouble." His laughter was cruel, thoughtless, the kind that spreads like wildfire across screens. Samuel's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. He didn't argue, didn't beg. He had endured interrogations before by people who didn't wear badges, by men who didn't ask politely. The sting of mockery was nothing compared to the memory of waiting 72 hours in a Laotian swamp, leeches crawling, breath held, waiting for an extraction that almost never came. One officer rifled through his pockets, pulling out a worn leather notebook, its cover frayed at the edges. He flipped it open, brow furrowing at the lists of names, some with small stars drawn beside them. "What's this? Some kind of code? Grandpa's secret bingo roster?" He tossed it onto the pavement with a chuckle. "Their names," Samuel said finally, his voice gravelly but clear. It silenced the laughter for a moment. "Men I served with." The officer shrugged, tossing the notebook back toward his boots. "Sure, whatever you say." They made him empty his truck. Out came lumber, nails, hardware supplies for a wheelchair ramp Samuel had promised to build for his neighbor's husband, a veteran recently confined to his home. "Yeah, right," the officer sneered, lifting a 2x4. "Wheelchair ramp. More like your next moonshine still." The second officer laughed loudly, circling again. "Should we check his meds too? Maybe he's forgotten who he is." Cars slowed as they passed. A few rolled down windows, gawking. A woman snapped a photo. Every new pair of eyes seemed to weigh Samuel down further, as though each judgment was another stone piled on his back. Still, his spine remained straight. "Possible stolen vehicle, elderly male, uncooperative tone," the officer reported into his radio. Uncooperative. That was the word they chose for his silence. They mistook dignity for defiance. They thought patience meant weakness. An hour passed. Heat shimmered off the asphalt. One officer sipped coffee while the other sat on the hood of the cruiser. Samuel remained on the curb, still, silent, immovable. And then, the wind shifted. Tires crunched. A black SUV turned onto the street, government plates gleaming. It didn't creep. It arrived with authority, gliding to a halt behind the cruisers. The back door opened, and a man stepped out in full dress uniform. 4 stars caught the dying light of the sun, shining like fire. The crowd gasped. The officers stiffened. The general's voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold. "Which of you stopped this man?" The world seemed to hold its breath. The silence after the general's question was heavier than the New Mexico heat. The 2 officers glanced at each other, panic breaking through their swagger. The taller one cleared his throat, trying to stand straighter. Sir, just a routine stop. Vehicle appeared unregistered, driver uncooperative." Uncooperative? The general's voice cut like a blade. His eyes dropped to Samuel Drake, still seated on the curb, his back upright, his breathing steady, his gaze unbroken. The general didn't salute, didn't smile. He simply pointed at the officers. "Do you even know who you're looking at?" Neither officer dared answer. The crowd across the street swelled, people drawn by the sudden presence of military brass in their quiet town. Phones were up, recording. The teenager who had mocked Samuel earlier was now whispering into his mic, "Wait, is this real?" The general's aide opened the SUV door wider, stepping out with a leather portfolio embossed with the presidential seal. The sight of it sent murmurs rippling through the bystanders. "Sir?" The taller officer tried again. The man was carrying a suspicious notebook. He bent, snatched it from the pavement, and held it up. "This right here." The general took 3 deliberate steps forward, his boots striking the asphalt like gavel blows. He plucked the notebook from the officer's hand and opened it. The pages were filled with names, dozens, maybe hundreds. Some were marked with small stars, others with crosses, some with neither. Dates scribbled in margins. Units abbreviated in ways that only made sense to men who had been there. The general's jaw tightened. He turned a page, then another. His hand trembled slightly. Finally, he looked up. His voice dropped, quiet but carrying across the street. "Do you even realize what you're holding?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Looks like a list, sir. Some kind of code." The general snapped the notebook shut, the sound like a gunshot in the still air. "It's not a code. It's a ledger of ghosts. Men who served, men who bled, men who never came home." He turned to the crowd, raising the notebook slightly. "This is history written in blood and silence." Gasps rippled outward. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." The general crouched down in front of Samuel, lowering himself so that their eyes were level. For the first time since arriving, his voice softened. "Sergeant Major Drake, I didn't expect to find you here like this." Samuel finally looked at him. His pale blue eyes, steady as the horizon, met the general's. "Didn't expect to be here either," he said simply. The general straightened and faced the officers again. "This man taught me everything I know about leadership. Fort Benning, 1982. He carried an entire squad through swamp recon when our comms failed. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here." The officers' faces went white. One stammered, We didn't know." "You didn't ask," the general shot back. The crowd shifted. A woman in nurse's scrubs stepped forward. "That man built my father's wheelchair ramp last summer. He wouldn't take a dime for it." Another voice, older, rasping with age, called out, "He fixed the roof at the senior center after the storm, every board, alone." Phones caught every word. The teenager filming now whispered into his mic again, voice awed, "This guy's not just some old man, he's a legend." The general turned slowly, his eyes burning into the cameras, into the officers, into every watching soul. His words landed like thunder. "You just stopped the man who trained me." The crowd fell into a hush so deep that even the desert cicadas seemed to pause their endless song. The words hung in the air, "the man who trained me." For a moment, time felt suspended. The younger officer's hand twitched at his belt, as though tempted to adjust his holster, but it was nerves, not necessity. His voice cracked as he muttered, "General, sir, we were only following protocol." The general's eyes snapped toward him. "Protocol?" His tone was ice. "Protocol is judgment, officer. Protocol without judgment is tyranny." Samuel Drake remained seated on the curb, his shoulders straight, his silence unyielding. To the crowd, his stillness looked like fragility, like the weariness of age. But the general knew better. That stillness was discipline, the same discipline that had kept him alive in jungles, in caves, in deserts, where even shadows could betray a man. The general held up the notebook once more. He opened it deliberately, flipping to a page with 7 names. His thumb brushed over the faint smudges where water, rain, or perhaps tears long ago had blurred the ink. "These men," he said, voice low but clear, "were with him in Laos, 1970. A mission that doesn't exist in your files, because it wasn't supposed to. He brought 3 home alive when the plan said none would make it back." The older officer's mouth went dry. He shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading at his temples despite the shade. The general closed the notebook again, clutching it like scripture. Do you understand now what you dismissed as gibberish? The younger officer stammered. Sir, we had no idea. Of course you didn't, the general snapped. You saw an old man in a rusted truck and thought that told you the story. You looked at his silence and mistook it for confusion. You looked at his scars and thought they were weakness, but you never asked. A ripple of shame ran through the onlookers. A teenager lowered his phone, suddenly ashamed of the mocking caption he had uploaded only minutes ago. Across the street, an old gas station clerk, Mike Alvarez, watched from the doorway, his jaw set. He had recognized Samuel at once. Recognized not just the man, but the bearing, the quiet steel that no amount of years could erase. Mike reached for his phone and dialed a number few in the town knew he had. He spoke quickly, his voice hushed but urgent. It's happening. They've got Drake sitting on the curb like a criminal. Yeah, that Drake. Back at the scene, one of the officers had begun writing tickets, his hand trembling with every stroke of the pen. Expired registration, he muttered, his voice defensive. Unsafe vehicle. Improper display of plates. The general turned slowly, his stare sharp enough to cut. You dare write him citations while you sit in the presence of a man whose name is written in history you will never even be cleared to read? The pen clattered from the officer's hand. The crowd's whispers grew louder now, shifting from curiosity to outrage. A woman said loudly enough for all to hear, that man built a shelter during the flood 5 years back. Saved my brother when the water rose. Another voice chimed in, he taught my son survival skills, made him the man he is today. Samuel remained still, absorbing none of it. Praise and insults weighed the same to him, just noise. His silence was not surrender. It was a test. He knew enough of human pride to let it reveal itself, to let men hang themselves with their own rope. But now, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched longer, the test was ending. The general's presence had shifted the balance. The storm Samuel had waited for was finally breaking. The general's next words rumbled like distant thunder. Stand him up. The order was simple, yet it landed like a hammer strike on the two officers. Neither moved at first, as though frozen in the weight of the moment. The taller one hesitated, eyes darting to Samuel Drake still seated on the curb, hands folded loosely over his knees, face calm as stone. The general's tone sharpened, slicing away their indecision. I said stand him up. Reluctantly, the younger officer bent down and extended a hand. Samuel ignored it. Instead, he pressed his palms against the pavement and rose under his own power. His knees groaned with age, but his back was straight, his chin level. He stood without trembling, without leaning, without help. The crowd inhaled as one. The quiet old man on the curb was suddenly a soldier again, his posture carrying the weight of 1,000 untold battles. The general stepped forward, closing the gap until he stood just 3 feet away. His gleaming shoes stopped in the dust. The 4 stars on his collar caught the fading sunlight, but even they seemed dim beside the fire in his eyes. Then, with a precision so sharp it cut the air, the general snapped into a salute. His arm locked, his posture ramrod straight. The crowd gasped, a ripple of disbelief coursing through them. He held the salute not for seconds, but for what felt like an eternity. The silence stretched until even the cicadas dared not sing. Sergeant Major Drake. The general's voice boomed, deep and resonant. It is the greatest honor of my career to salute you. You trained me. You saved me. And this country still walks free because of men like you. The words struck like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted in whispers. Phones shook in trembling hands. Across the street, the teenager who had mocked Samuel earlier lowered his camera, his face pale, shame burning his cheeks. Samuel's eyes softened for the first time that day. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his weathered hand and returned the salute. His palm trembled slightly with age, but the gesture was no less powerful. 2 warriors, separated by generations, locked in a moment of pure reverence. The general dropped his arm only after Samuel did. He turned to face the 2 officers, whose faces were now bloodless masks of dread. His voice hardened to steel. You see this man? You mocked him. You wrote tickets for him. You treated him like a criminal. And you did it without ever asking who he was. This man is Sergeant Major Samuel Drake, a veteran of 3 wars, the architect of survival protocols still used in combat today, the leader of missions you will never read about because they are buried under top-secret clearance. He is not a relic. He is the foundation on which our entire command was built. The taller officer's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. The younger one shifted his weight, staring at his boots. The general stepped closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that carried across the stunned crowd. You dishonored yourselves. You dishonored the badge. And worst of all, you dishonored a man whose silence has carried more weight than your words ever will. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for judgment. And Samuel, finally breaking his quiet, spoke not with anger, not with fire, but with something heavier. They're just kids, General. We were the same once, arrogant, loud, blind to the shoulders we stood on. His words fell like a benediction, softening the fury that hung in the air. The general's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly, reluctantly, acknowledging the mercy in Samuel's voice. But his eyes told a different story. The reckoning wasn't over. The crowd shifted, restless now, as though sensing that something larger than tickets or protocol was about to erupt. The 2 officers, sweat streaking their temples, stood like guilty schoolboys caught scribbling lies on the blackboard. The general's gaze locked onto them, sharp as a bayonet. Step forward. They obeyed, their boots scuffing on the pavement. Their uniforms, so crisp when the day began, suddenly looked flimsy under the weight of the silence pressing down on them. Names, the general demanded. The taller one stuttered. Oh, Officer Reynolds, sir. Officer Keller, sir, the younger mumbled, eyes fixed on the asphalt. The general repeated their names slowly, deliberately, as if carving them into stone. Then he turned to the crowd, raising his voice so all could hear. These men stopped Sergeant Major Samuel Drake without cause, without respect, without judgment. They saw rust and wrinkles and silence, and they thought it meant nothing, but it meant everything. And today, in front of all of you, they will learn the lesson their academy failed to teach. The crowd leaned forward, phones lifted again. No one wanted to miss what came next. The general's eyes burned into Reynolds. You mocked his truck. Do you know what that vehicle carried? Medical supplies through hurricane floods, ammunition into combat zones, and once a flag-draped coffin of a soldier who had no family left to bury him. Reynolds swallowed hard, throat clicking. Then the general pivoted to Keller. And you called him confused, suggested his silence meant dementia. That silence you mocked is the silence of a man who's endured interrogations, firefights, and 48-hour waits for rescue. That silence built the discipline you've never even tasted. Keller's face flushed crimson. His lips trembled, as though words might come, but none dared. The general stepped back, his voice carrying like rolling thunder. You have disgraced your uniforms, and now you will answer not to me, not to your sheriff, but to the man you disrespected. All eyes turned to Samuel Drake. He stood still, shoulders squared, hands folded loosely behind his back. The years seemed to melt from him in that instant, not because his body was younger, but because his presence was timeless, unshakable. Slowly, he stepped toward the officers. His boots crunched gravel with deliberate weight. When he stopped, he was so close that they could see every scar etched into his weathered face. You wrote me tickets, he said, voice low, steady, but I've carried debts heavier than paper. You mocked my silence, but silence is what kept my men alive. You thought I was no one, but every name in that notebook is someone who trusted me with their last breath. The words struck harder than any shout could. The officer's eyes flickered, shame gnawing through their pride. Samuel leaned in, his tone softening, almost pitying. You don't owe me an apology. You owe it to the next man you stop before you decide who he is. The crowd erupted not with cheers, but with murmurs of awe, nods of agreement, a rising tide of respect that swelled through the street. The general's face remained a mask of stern command, but his eyes glistened faintly. He raised his arm once more, sharp as a blade, and saluted again. This time, the entire crowd followed. Dozens of hands, trembling and unsure at first, then steady, rose into the air. Soldiers, veterans, civilians, even the teenager with the phone. A mass salute, a tidal wave of respect crashing against years of silence. And Samuel Drake, calm, scarred, and unyielding, stood at the center of it all. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Rows of hands lifted in unison, imperfect but sincere, cutting through the dusty New Mexico air like blades of honor. The crowd had grown neighbors, veterans, strangers who had stopped their cars at the sight of the black SUV. Now, dozens stood at attention, saluting the old soldier they had once overlooked. Even the two officers, flushed and trembling, raised their hands. Their salutes were clumsy, but they held them, afraid to break the fragile, thunderous silence. Samuel Drake did not move immediately. He let the weight of the moment settle. His eyes scanned the faces young, old, curious, ashamed. For so many years he had lived unseen, his service buried beneath layers of secrecy and silence. And yet here, on a cracked stretch of asphalt, the truth had risen like a flag at dawn. Slowly, deliberately, Samuel raised his own hand, returning the salute. His wrist was steady, his palm angled sharp, his weathered fingers curled just so. The posture was perfect, because it wasn't just form, it was memory. Memory of fallen comrades, of battles never spoken, of oaths never broken. The general's voice thundered across the gathering. This man, Sergeant Major Samuel Drake, trained generations of warriors. He led missions no one will ever read about, because they were too dangerous, too vital, too secret. And yet, when he came home, what did we give him? Silence, suspicion, disrespect. His voice hardened. That ends today. A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd, like the echo of a promise. Samuel lowered his hand. His voice, though quiet, carried farther than the general's thunder. Respect isn't about medals. It's not about stars or ribbons or files locked in some archive. Respect is what you give before you know who someone is. Because once you know, it's already too late. A hush fell again. Even children stilled, sensing the gravity of the lesson. The general turned to the two officers, his stare like ice. Your academy failed you. But this man has just taught you more in one sentence than I could in a year. Learn it, live it, or leave the uniform behind. The younger officer, Keller, swallowed hard. His salute faltered. His voice shook, but he forced the words out. Sir, He turned towards Samuel, his throat dry. Sergeant Major. I'm sorry. Samuel studied him for a long moment. Then he gave a small nod, the barest acknowledgement, but enough to make Keller's eyes sting. The general snapped his fingers, and his aide stepped forward with a slim black case. From it, he withdrew a weathered, folded flag. He handed it to Samuel with both hands, as though offering a crown. This was flown over the Pentagon on the anniversary of 9/11, the general said. It belongs with you, not with me. Samuel accepted it, his grip steady. For the first time that day, his voice trembled. Too many flags, too many coffins. But I'll carry this one. The crowd broke into applause, not the raucous clapping of celebration, but the slow, rising rhythm of reverence, like a heartbeat echoing through the town. And as the sound swelled, Samuel Drake stood taller than he had in years. The applause faded into murmurs, but no one left. The air was heavy, electric, as though everyone sensed they were standing in the middle of a story that would outlive them all. General Phillips, his voice quieter now, but still commanding, turned back to the crowd. You deserve to know why this man matters. You see an old truck, a cap, a flannel shirt. I see the man who saved 23 lives in a Colombian jungle in 1986. I see the man who wrote the first protocols for high-altitude rescues. I see the mentor who pulled me from a swamp at Fort Bragg when I thought I'd never breathe again. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Some gasped. Others lowered their phones, realizing that what they captured wasn't just viral content, it was living history. Samuel stood still, his flag folded in his arms. His eyes flickered to the side, toward the notebook in his pocket. He didn't want his story told. Heroes don't. But the general's voice pushed past his reluctance, as if speaking to ghosts as much as the living. Afghanistan, 1978. Phillips continued. A mission that never existed. 6 men went in, 3 came back, only because of him. After 9/11, when most men his age were fishing or watching ball games, he returned to train the next generation men like me. And everything I know about leadership, about honor, about survival I learned from Samuel Drake. The crowd's murmur grew into something deeper. Awe. A woman in nurse's scrubs edged forward. He donated blood every month for 30 years, she said. I know because I was the one drawing it. Never missed an appointment. Another voice rose from the back. He built my brother's wheelchair ramp after his stroke, wouldn't take a dime. A teenager lowered his head, guilt burning in his cheeks. He had been the one to mock Samuel earlier, to snap a photo and upload it with careless cruelty. Now he wanted nothing more than to delete it from existence. The officers shifted uneasily, as though the truth weighed heavier than any badge. Keller glanced at Samuel, shame etching itself into his features. His lips parted, but he stopped. Words caught in his throat. Samuel finally spoke. His tone was quiet, but it carried over the crowd. Stop counting. Stop measuring. It doesn't matter how many missions or how many medals. What matters is whether you showed up when someone needed you. His words struck harder than the general's thunder. They were simple, stripped of pride, but soaked in truth. The crowd stilled again. General Phillips drew a sharp breath, then snapped his salute once more. Sergeant Major, you still teach us, even now. Samuel didn't salute back this time. He simply gave a faint, almost invisible nod. A nod that meant, lesson given, lesson received. And in that moment, everyone knew the real story of Samuel Drake wasn't what he had done in jungles or deserts. It was what he was still doing now. Teaching. By silence. By patience. By enduring. The reckoning wasn't finished. But the truth had begun to claw its way free. The weight of the crowd's silence pressed hardest on the two officers. Their earlier smirks had evaporated, replaced by pale, drawn faces. The general's glare lingered on them like a spotlight, but it was Samuel Drake's calm, unreadable eyes that made them squirm the most. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat, but the sound cracked. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, words retreating like cowards. Keller, the younger of the two, finally stepped forward. His hand trembled as he reached up to remove his cap. Sergeant Major, Keller said, his voice barely more than a whisper, I disrespected you. I mocked what I didn't understand. I thought you were just another old man in a broken truck. I was wrong. I see that now. The words spilled clumsily, but the sincerity in them was unmistakable. His chest rose and fell quickly, as though he'd just sprinted a mile. Reynolds, cornered by shame, followed suit. Sir, I didn't ask questions, I judged. I treated you like a criminal when I should have treated you like a neighbor, like a man. I can't undo it, but... His voice cracked, and for the first time, he looked smaller than his badge. I'm sorry. The general's face softened, only slightly. He turned to Samuel. The choice is yours, Sergeant Major. Their apology belongs to you. Samuel looked at the two men for a long, heavy moment. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. The crowd leaned in, waiting for a roar of condemnation, for the justice they thought he deserved. Instead, Samuel spoke quietly. Respect isn't about me. It's about the next man you stop, the next woman walking home, the next veteran who keeps his silence because it hurts too much to speak. That's who you owe. Keller swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. Then I'll spend the rest of my career making sure I never forget this lesson. Reynolds nodded sharply. Me too. Samuel gave a small nod, not forgiveness exactly, but something more useful, acknowledgement. Then, in a voice low but firm, he added, Don't apologize with words. Apologize with how you serve. The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone clapped once, then stopped, sensing the moment wasn't for celebration but for reflection. The general stepped between them all, his tone shifting from fury to finality. Then it's decided, lesson delivered, lesson received. But make no mistake, this story won't end here. The crowd stirred again, anticipation sparking in their eyes. Because they knew he was right. Samuel Drake's silence had been broken, and the ripples of this reckoning were only beginning. News travels faster than fire in dry grass. By nightfall, the video of Samuel Drake sitting on the curb, flanked by mocking officers, had spread across the internet like a storm front. By dawn, millions had seen the clip of the four-star general stepping from the SUV, saluting the old man everyone else dismissed. Hashtags exploded. Number, respect the quiet. Number, silent hero. Number, you never know who. But for Samuel, nothing changed. At sunrise, he still climbed into his rattling truck, still carried lumber in the back, still drove down to the neighbor's house to finish fixing her wheelchair ramp. Fame meant nothing. The work remained. For Officer Keller, though, everything changed. The shame burned into him. Every time he looked at his badge, he remembered Samuel's words. Respect isn't about me. It's about the next man you stop. He replayed them in his head like a prayer, like a curse. He started small, visiting the VFW hall on weekends. At first, the veterans eyed him with suspicion, the cop who disrespected one of their own. But when they learned Samuel had poured him coffee and said, "You learn from it, or someone else pays next time," the doors opened slowly. Reynolds, too, carried the weight. He drove patrol routes differently, his eyes searching faces, not just plates and tags. No one told him to, but something inside him refused to go back to blind enforcement. At the sheriff's office, training manuals were rewritten. A laminated card found its way into every rookie's pocket. 6 words, in bold. You never know who you're stopping. The transformation spread further than anyone expected. Across the country, departments began adding veteran awareness sessions to their programs. VFW halls overflowed with visitors, curious officers asking questions, hearing stories they had never heard before. And in Samuel's small town, a bronze plaque was bolted into the sidewalk at the corner of Maple and Pine. It read, "Here sat Sergeant Major Samuel Drake. A man disrespected, then honored. A reminder. Respect first. Always." Samuel walked past it only once. He shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and never mentioned it again. But others did. Tourists stopped for photos. Veterans touched it like a shrine. Children traced the letters with their fingers. For Samuel, the transformation wasn't about plaques or hashtags. It was about the young cop who now showed up at his porch every Saturday, hammer in hand, ready to help build ramps for strangers. About the officer who poured concrete next to him without complaint. About the neighbor who stopped him on the street and said, "I never knew. Thank you." The world hadn't changed because of Samuel Drake. The world had changed because it had been forced to see him, and that, Samuel thought, as he sat in his truck watching the sun dip low, was enough. Weeks turned into months, but the story refused to fade. News outlets revisited it, documentaries asked for interviews. Samuel Drake refused them all. When a reporter cornered him outside the hardware store, he said only, "I'm busy, got work to do." And then he loaded lumber into the back of his truck and drove away. But others carried the story forward. The Sheriff's Department created the Drake Initiative, a program requiring every officer to log volunteer hours serving veterans in their communities. The first project? Building wheelchair ramps, Samuel's quiet specialty. The general returned, not in uniform, but in plain clothes. He sat on Samuel's porch with 2 mugs of coffee. No cameras, no speeches. Just 2 men watching the horizon. "You've always been teaching, even when you didn't mean to," the general said softly. Samuel chuckled. "If they needed me to sit on a curb to figure it out, then maybe I finally did my job." The general raised his mug. "To lessons that last." The town changed too. Every Memorial Day, the parade stopped at the bronze plaque. The crowd stood in silence, hats over hearts, children wide-eyed, not for Samuel alone, but for everyone like him, the veterans whose stories never made headlines, whose service lived in silence. Even Keller changed. He rose through the ranks, but more importantly, he earned the trust of the veterans he once mocked. At the VFW, he gave speeches not about his own career, but about the man who had once stared at him with those pale, steady eyes and said, "Respect is what you give before you know who someone is." One evening, Keller knocked on Samuel's door. He held a folded piece of paper. "It's my resignation," he said. Samuel frowned. "Why?" "Because I can do more out there teaching recruits, training departments, carrying this lesson further than our little town." Samuel looked at the paper, then back at Keller. "Then don't resign, son, repurpose." And so he did. Keller became a trainer, his first lecture always beginning with the same 6 words. You never know who you're stopping. As for Samuel Drake, he kept driving his old truck, kept hammering nails into ramps, kept living quietly. But now, when people saw him on the street, they didn't look past him. They stepped aside, nodded, and sometimes, just sometimes, they saluted. One summer afternoon, a boy approached him shyly outside the gas station. "Sir," the boy said, "are you famous?" Samuel looked down. his weathered face softening into the faintest smile. "No, son," he said gently. "I'm real." The boy beamed, not fully understanding, but carrying the weight of the words anyway. And with that, Samuel climbed into his rattling Chevy, the truck coughing to life, a living relic rolling steady down Main Street. Not a hero, not a myth, just a man who never stopped serving.